It was supposed to be a new beginning. Ridgeview Heights, with its winding, tree-lined streets and carefully kept lawns, had the kind of quiet charm Daniel and Elena Carter thought they'd been chasing for years. After more than a decade of city noise, traffic jams, and long commutes that stretched late into the night, they were ready to slow down. Daniel was 41 years old, a seasoned architect whose designs could be found scattered across half the state. He was proud of the buildings he'd created, schools, libraries, bridges, but he was more proud of finally being able to buy a home where he and Elena could build a quieter life. Elena, 36, had carried a weight of her own, though Daniel only knew parts of it. She told neighbors she worked in fitness and physical conditioning. What she left unspoken was far more extraordinary. When they first pulled into Ridgeview Heights in the spring, the neighborhood looked perfect. The houses stood proud but modest, mostly two-story brick colonials with bright shutters and blooming gardens. Children rode bicycles down the cul-de-sac. Retirees trimmed hedges with quiet satisfaction. Even the air seemed different, lighter, calmer, almost designed for deep breaths and slow evenings. For Daniel, it was everything he had wanted for Elena. He thought of it as her reward, a long pause after years of sacrifice. For her, he imagined this was where she could finally just be a wife, a neighbor, someone ordinary. The house they chose sat at the end of Willow Bend Drive, a 4-bedroom home with wide windows and a yard Elena quickly claimed as her own training ground. It wasn't the biggest house in Ridgeview Heights, but it was theirs. Daniel could picture morning coffee on the porch, weekend dinners with friends, and most importantly, a sense of belonging that the city had never given them. They moved in on a Saturday morning, hauling boxes from the rented truck, smiling as neighbors waved politely from across the street. The house they chose sat at the end of Willow Bend Drive, a 4-bedroom home with wide windows and a yard Elena quickly claimed as her own training ground. It wasn't the biggest house in Ridgeview Heights, but it was theirs. Daniel could picture morning coffee on the porch, weekend dinners with friends, and most importantly, a sense of belonging that the city had never given them. They moved in on a Saturday morning, hauling boxes from the rented truck, smiling as neighbors waved politely from across the street. For the first few weeks, life felt exactly as promised. Elena jogged at sunrise, her pace steady and disciplined, though Daniel never questioned how she could run 6 miles without breaking a sweat. In the afternoons, she worked in the backyard, where her fitness routines sometimes looked more like military drills than casual exercise. Daniel was too caught up in unpacking his office and settling into new architectural contracts to notice the details. And besides, he trusted her. Elena had always been composed, always had an edge of mystery. He thought that was just part of her charm. But there was something else in Ridgeview Heights that Daniel began to sense almost immediately. Something he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't in the manicured lawns or the polite smiles. It was in the way people looked over their shoulders when they spoke, the way their voices lowered when certain topics came up. He first noticed it at the small neighborhood cafe on Main Street. A group of residents were laughing about a yard sale when one man walked in, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a navy blue polo shirt with a shiny badge clipped neatly to his belt. The laughter died instantly. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Even the barista froze for a second before plastering on a smile. The man gave a slow nod to the room, almost like royalty acknowledging subjects. Daniel didn't know his name yet, but he remembered the way people looked at him. Cautious, deferential, as if whatever he said would go unchallenged. When the man left with his coffee, the cafe seemed to exhale like tension slipping out of a clenched jaw. That night Daniel mentioned it to Elena. "There's someone in town. Everyone seems careful around," he said, describing the man's posture. The badge, the way silence followed him like a shadow. Elena paused for a moment, setting her fork down before answering. Every neighborhood has someone like that. People who need to be seen as important. She smiled faintly, but Daniel caught something in her eyes, an awareness, a calculation like she had already logged his description into a mental file. Days later, they met him in person. His name was Victor Hale, and he lived 2 streets over on Juniper Lane. He introduced himself as a county deputy sheriff, his handshake firm, his tone dripping with practiced authority. "We keep things orderly around here," Victor said, gesturing vaguely at the quiet row of houses. "Folks like knowing I'm close by if anything gets out of hand." He said it with a smile, but there was something performative about the words, something rehearsed, like a line from a play he'd spoken 100 times before. Daniel nodded politely, grateful at first. Who wouldn't want law enforcement nearby? Elena gave a faint smile, but said little. Her silence wasn't rudeness. Daniel knew that about her. It was observation. She was studying him the way she studied new environments everywhere they went, her eyes catching details others overlooked. The Carters continued settling into their routine. They invited Daniel's sister for dinner. They hosted a backyard barbecue. They walked the streets at dusk, enjoying the cool breeze off the hills. But with each passing day, Daniel began noticing how often Victor appeared. He wasn't just a neighbor you bumped into occasionally. He was everywhere, walking his German Shepherd up and down the street, leaning against his cruiser parked just where everyone could see it, chatting with neighbors in tones that seemed less friendly and more like interrogations. One evening, as Daniel rolled the garbage bins to the curb, he saw Victor standing across the street, arms crossed, watching him. Not just watching, studying like he was measuring something. When their eyes met, Victor raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. The gesture should have felt neighborly, but instead it carried weight, as if it wasn't a greeting, but a reminder, "I see you. I'm watching." Daniel mentioned it again to Elena later that night. "He's around a lot," he said, almost like he's keeping track of things. Elena, who had just finished a series of push-ups in the living room, sat back on her heels. "People like that thrive on being noticed," she replied carefully. But Daniel saw the subtle tension in her shoulders, the alertness that had crept in. Elena didn't dismiss people easily. If she was alert, it meant she saw something he didn't. And that was when Daniel first felt it, the shift. Ridgeview Heights was beautiful, yes, with its quiet streets and cheerful mailboxes. But beneath the surface, there was a hum of unease, like a string pulled too tight. Neighbors were kind, but also guarded, and everything seemed to orbit around one man with a badge and a title no one questioned. It was in those first few weeks that Daniel began to realize their new life wasn't going to be as quiet as they hoped. Because in Ridgeview Heights, peace wasn't natural. It was enforced, or at least that's what Victor Hale wanted everyone to believe. And while Daniel couldn't yet imagine how far Victor's reach extended, Elena already knew. She had seen men like him before, men who mistook intimidation for power. What Victor didn't know was that he had chosen the wrong family to shadow, the wrong woman to try to corner. Elena Carter had trained warriors, broken men down, and rebuilt them into soldiers capable of surviving the harshest realities. She hadn't moved to Ridgeview Heights to fight, but when the time came, she would. The Carters had come searching for normalcy. Instead, they had stepped into a neighborhood under the watchful eye of a man whose authority was nothing more than a mask. And behind that mask, as they would soon discover, lay something far darker than anyone could have imagined. For the first month in Ridgeview Heights, Daniel Carter allowed himself to believe in the promise of the neighborhood. It had all the ingredients of the quiet life he'd dreamed about: trimmed lawns, weekend barbecues, children chasing basketballs down the cul-de-sac. And yet, threading through that peace was the presence of one man, always visible, always positioned just so like a sentry, guarding gates only he believed existed. His name, as Daniel and Elena soon learned, was Victor Hale. Victor was 39 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that seemed rehearsed in front of a mirror. He introduced himself the way actors deliver a monologue, steady eye contact, a handshake held 1 second too long, the kind of slow smile that said, "I am in control here." He carried himself not just as a neighbor, but as an overseer. The first proper introduction happened on a warm Friday evening when Daniel was unpacking patio furniture in the backyard. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel and turned to see a figure standing near the fence. The man wore a navy polo shirt with the word "Sheriff" stitched in bold gold lettering across the chest. A polished badge gleamed on his belt, catching the sunset. Behind him, parked at a strategic angle on the curb, was a black and white police cruiser with its lights off, but unmistakably present. "You must be the Carters," the man said, his voice smooth, but carrying the cadence of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Victor Hale. I keep an eye on things around here." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and extended one in greeting. "Daniel Carter. And yes, this is my wife, Elena." Elena approached from the side of the house, her hair pulled back after an evening run. She gave Hale a polite nod, but did not extend her hand. Victor noticed, but didn't falter. "I like to meet new folks personally," he continued, glancing deliberately at the police cruiser, as if to remind them of its presence. "You'll find Ridgeview Heights is one of the safest neighborhoods in the county. That's no accident. People here know I'm always close by." The words were delivered like a gift wrapped in velvet paper, but Daniel sensed the weight beneath them. This was not simply an introduction, it was a declaration. Victor wasn't just their neighbor, he was positioning himself as the guardian of Ridgeview Heights. In the days that followed, Victor's presence seemed to ripple through every corner of the community. On Saturday mornings, he strolled the sidewalks with his German shepherd, a hulking animal named Titan. Children pointed at the dog with admiration, parents waved from porches, and Victor returned each gesture with the calm authority of a man accepting tribute. On weekday evenings he parked his cruiser at the entrance of Willow Bend, drive lights off windows cracked a silent signal that law and order lived here because he allowed it. Daniel noticed how neighbors leaned into conversations with Victor, their voices carrying both gratitude and caution. "Deputy Hale makes sure packages don't get stolen," one woman whispered with admiration at the local cafe. "He stopped a stranger's car just last week." Another neighbor, a retired teacher, spoke of Victor like a shield. "You sleep better at night knowing he's watching." And sleep better they did, though Daniel couldn't shake the thought that what they were experiencing wasn't comfort, but conditioning. Still, he kept his reservations quiet. He was new here, after all. Who was he to question the man everyone else seemed to view as indispensable? Elena, however, was less subtle. One evening, as they walked home from the corner store, Victor passed by in his cruiser, slowing enough to lower the window. "Evening, Carters," he said with a smile that showed too many teeth. Elena returned the nod, but said nothing until the cruiser turned the corner. "He patrols like he owns the place," she murmured under her breath. Daniel glanced at her. "Maybe he's just thorough. People seem to like having him around." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's the thing about people like him. They don't just want to be liked, they want to be necessary." The next day, Daniel saw proof of it. He was in his driveway repairing a loose hinge on the garage when Victor appeared again, hands resting on his duty belt. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone formal. "Just wanted to check in. How's the adjustment going?" Daniel hesitated, feeling the weight of those watchful eyes. "We're settling in fine. Appreciate you asking. Victor nodded approvingly. Good. This is a tight community. Folks here respect order. You'll find it makes life easier if you keep things in line. His eyes flicked to the garage, then back to Daniel, and for a moment, Daniel felt less like a neighbor being greeted and more like a soldier receiving inspection. Word about Victor traveled fast not because he spread it, but because everyone else did. At the Sunday farmers market, Daniel overheard two families talking about how lucky Ridgeview Heights was to have a real deputy living among them. At the local diner, the waitress mentioned how she always felt safer when Victor was eating breakfast in uniform at the counter. His legend wasn't just built by his presence, it was reinforced by the quiet relief of those who believed him. And yet, in all these stories, one thing struck Daniel as odd. No one mentioned the sheriff's department itself. It was always Victor singular, operating like a lone sentinel rather than part of an actual law enforcement body. No partners, no squad cars dropping by, no mention of shift rotations. Just Victor and his cruiser and the badge that gleamed too brightly in the sunlight. Elena noticed it too. She never said much in public, but Daniel caught her eyes narrowing whenever Victor appeared. She studied him the way she studied combat drills, watching for patterns, weaknesses, the tells of a man trying too hard. She didn't trust easily, and Victor, despite his polished smile, had already tripped alarms in her mind. But Daniel, ever the optimist, tried to see the benefit. Maybe he really is what this neighborhood needs. He told her one evening, "People respect him. He keeps things orderly." Elena's gaze lingered on the cruiser idling 2 houses away, headlights off engine, faintly humming. "Order," she said softly, almost to herself. "Or control. There's a difference." That difference, though still invisible to most of Ridgeview Heights, would soon become the fracture line that split the entire community open. For now, however, Victor Hale stood tall in his uniform, Titan at his side, cruiser gleaming under the streetlight. To everyone else, he was the protector next door, the guardian who made Ridgeview Heights one of the safest suburbs in the county. To Daniel and Elena Carter, though, he was something else, entirely a question mark, in a badge and a uniform. And though they didn't yet realize it, Victor's watchful shadow was already creeping closer to their front door. By the middle of summer, Daniel Carter finally felt like Ridgeview Heights was starting to look like home. He had finished unpacking his drafting tables. Elena had carved out her workout space in the backyard, and together they had begun shaping the property to reflect their own sense of order and privacy. The project that mattered most was the fence. Daniel had always dreamed of a modern steel and glass barrier, tall enough to provide privacy, but sleek enough to complement the architecture of their house. For him, it wasn't about shutting out the neighborhood, it was about creating a sanctuary, a defined boundary between the world outside and the life he and Elena were building together. So one Monday morning, a flatbed truck pulled up with steel panels, stacked high, each one gleaming in the sunlight. The contractors set to work, measuring welding and anchoring posts into the ground. By evening, the first sections of the fence stood in place, 6 feet tall, sharp lines cutting against the suburban skyline. Daniel admired it with satisfaction, proud not just of the craftsmanship, but of what it symbolized, a space that belonged solely to them. That night, as he sat on the porch sipping iced tea, he noticed headlights slowing near the curb. The familiar silhouette of a police cruiser came into focus, engine idling low. The driver's window slid down, and Victor Hale leaned out his badge, catching a glint of the street lamp. He didn't wave. He just stared at the new fence, his jaw tightening as though someone had just drawn a curtain across his personal stage. By the next morning, Victor made his move. Daniel was tightening bolts on the fence line when he heard the sound of boots crunching on gravel. "Morning, Carter," Victor said, his tone friendlier than his eyes. "I see you've been busy." Yeah, Daniel replied, forcing a smile, finally getting the place to feel like ours. Victor walked closer, arms crossed, gaze sweeping up and down the steel panels. It's a good-looking fence, I'll give you that. But 6 feet. That's a bit much, don't you think? Blocks the line of sight. Could create a security risk. Daniel frowned. We checked the city code. The ordinance allows fences up to 8 feet. We even had the permits approved. Victor smiled thinly like a teacher correcting a student. Codes and ordinances are one thing. Community safety is another. Visibility matters. You wouldn't want to give the wrong impression, would you? There it was again, that subtle shift from suggestion to command wrapped in the velvet of authority. Daniel tried to keep his tone level. I think we're well within our rights. And honestly, my wife works from home. Privacy is important to her. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Privacy is fine, Carter, but walls this high, they don't just keep people out. They hide what's inside. Neighbors notice things like that. He let the words hang, then gave a curt nod before turning on his heel. The message was clear. The fence wasn't just a structure. It was a challenge to his control. 2 days later, the warning came. Daniel found an envelope tucked neatly under his front door. Inside was an official-looking letter, stamped with the logo of a prominent law firm downtown. The paper was thick embossed and carried the smell of fresh ink. The language was stern. Your property is in violation of neighborhood standards. Failure to lower your fence to 4 feet will result in fines of $500 per day. Daniel's stomach tightened. He read it twice, then showed it to Elena as she finished her morning run. Sweat beaded on her brow, her breathing steady despite the miles she'd just logged. She read the letter once, then again, her expression unreadable. They can't do this, she said flatly. We have permits. This is illegal. Her tone had the certainty of someone who understood rules at a level deeper than paperwork. Daniel tried to steady his own nerves. Maybe we should call the law firm just to be sure. He did. That afternoon, after waiting through 3 transfers, he finally spoke with a receptionist who sounded genuinely baffled. Mr. Carter, we've never had a case involving your address, and we certainly didn't send that letter. Could you email us a copy? Daniel hung up with a chill running down his spine. Whoever had written the letter had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look real. Embossed seals, legal phrasing, paper stock heavy enough to feel authentic. It wasn't the work of someone casually making threats. This was deliberate. When he told Elena, she didn't look surprised. She only grew quieter, her eyes flicking toward the backyard, where the fence now cast long evening shadows. This isn't about the fence, she murmured. This is about control. He's testing how far he can push us. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt louder. Every flicker of headlights across the window made his pulse jump. He rose at midnight, pacing the living room, and through the curtain he caught sight of Victor's cruiser parked 2 houses down. Engine off, lights out, just sitting there in the dark, as if to remind them whose shadow they lived under. By morning, the neighborhood had shifted. Mrs. Lang from across the street, who had once stopped to compliment Elena's roses, walked her dog quickly past their house without making eye contact. The friendly couple from next door, who had waved enthusiastically on move-in day, now lingered less on their porch, retreating inside when Daniel stepped out. Whispers traveled faster than the breeze, and though no one said it to their faces, Daniel felt the unspoken judgment. Their fence wasn't just tall, it was a statement, a defiance. Elena, however, remained calm, almost unnervingly so. She moved through her routines with the same precision as always, early runs, backyard drills, phone calls she described as work-related. But Daniel noticed changes. She checked the locks more often. She positioned her chair at dinner where she could see the front window. She kept her phone face down, but within reach at all times. One evening, as they ate in silence, Daniel finally asked, "Do you think he's bluffing?" Elena looked up slowly, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "No. Men like Victor don't bluff. They escalate." And escalate he did. Within a week, Daniel found another letter, this one slipped under his windshield wiper at the grocery store. The handwriting was different, almost casual, but the message was the same: lower the fence. Work with the community. Don't make this harder than it has to be. It was no longer just Victor, it was the neighborhood, or at least the illusion of it. Daniel began to feel like he and Elena were on trial in a court, where the rules were written by one man and enforced through silence and fear. But what Victor didn't know, what no one yet knew, was that Elena Carter was not just a fitness enthusiast or a woman concerned with privacy. She was a U.S. Navy SEAL trainer, a senior chief petty officer who had spent nearly 2 decades molding warriors to survive the most dangerous situations on Earth. She had lived in shadows darker than Victor could imagine, and she knew the signs of a man drunk on false power. The fence had become more than steel and bolts. It was now a line drawn in the sand, a test of will between a man wielding counterfeit authority and a woman who understood what real authority meant. And while the neighbors whispered and avoided eye contact, Elena's eyes sharpened, her posture grew straighter, and her silence became the calm before the storm. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the battle for Ridgeview Heights had already begun, and it started with a fence 6 feet of steel that cut more than property lines. It cut straight into the illusion of control that Victor Hale had built, exposing cracks that would soon split wide open. The fence was supposed to be the end of it. 6 feet of steel, clean lines, legal permits, city approvals. Daniel Carter thought the matter should have rested there. But fences don't just keep people out. They invite suspicion. And in Ridgeview Heights, suspicion spread faster than weeds through an untended garden. It began quietly. Daniel noticed the subtle shifts. First, neighbors who had once waved now pretended not to see him. The friendly smiles exchanged at the mailbox dissolved into tight lips and hurried steps. Conversations that used to blossom over trimmed hedges now ended abruptly when he approached. Mrs. Lang, the sweet widow across the street, who once dropped off blueberry muffins, now looked down at her shoes when she passed by, tugging her dog along with unnecessary haste. At first, Daniel thought it was coincidence. People got busy. People had moods. But patterns reveal themselves if you're paying attention. And this pattern had Victor Hale's fingerprints all over it. The first note appeared on a Thursday morning tucked neatly under the windshield wiper of Daniel's truck. Work with the community. Don't stand apart. Lower the fence. The handwriting was neat, almost polite, but the tone was unmistakable. A warning dressed as advice. Daniel crumpled it, shoving it deep into his pocket, unwilling to show Elena right away. He didn't want her to think the neighborhood had turned hostile. But by Saturday, another note arrived, this one slipped under their front doormat. This neighborhood values openness. People who hide things make others nervous. Different handwriting. Same message. Daniel showed it to Elena over breakfast. She read it once, set it down, and resumed eating, her expression unchanged. "Do you want to talk about it?" Daniel asked cautiously. Elena shook her head. "It's just noise, designed to get a reaction. If we give them one, it works." Her calm unsettled him. Most people would have fumed, cursed, maybe even stormed over to confront Victor. But Elena's stillness was like water, in a deep well, quiet on the surface, but impossibly vast underneath. By the third week, the whispers reached Daniel directly. At the corner cafe where he often grabbed coffee before heading to the firm, he overheard 2 women at the next table. "She's hiding something," one said, her voice low, but insistent. "I heard she works with the military. Something classified." The other woman leaned in, wide-eyed. "That explains the fence. Who builds something like that, unless they have something to protect? Daniel clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to interrupt. But what would he say? That his wife was just private. That privacy was a right, not a crime. He stayed silent, burning inside, and walked out with his coffee untouched. Elena, on the other hand, moved through the storm with the precision of a soldier. Daniel began to see habits he had never questioned before, small details that suddenly stood out in sharp relief. Whenever they entered a restaurant, she chose a seat that gave her a full view of the room and every exit. On their evening walks, her eyes scanned constantly alleys, rooftops, parked cars, while her pace never wavered. Even in their own home, she positioned herself strategically back, to the wall-clear line of sight, to the Windows phone always within reach. Daniel had once thought of it as quirks, maybe even overcaution left over from whatever stress she carried at work. Now, under the weight of Victor's campaign, those quirks looked less like habits and more like tactics. The notes escalated. Some were typed, others scribbled in angry ink. One read, "We don't trust what we can't see. Lower the wall." Another, "Good neighborhoods don't need secrets. Leave if you can't live like the rest of us." The cruelest came late one night, slid under the front door while Daniel and Elena slept upstairs. Elena found it in the morning, simple and stark. People who don't belong have accidents. Daniel's hands shook as he held the paper. "This is a threat," he snapped. "We need to call the police." Elena met his eyes calmly. And which police would that be? Victor? The truth hit him like a stone. In Ridgeview Heights, the man they would be reporting to was the man orchestrating it all. The false guardian who had convinced everyone he was indispensable had turned the entire neighborhood into his stage. One evening, desperate for some sense of normalcy, Daniel accepted an invitation from his co-worker, a young architect named Thomas, who lived 3 streets away. They met for beers at a small bar outside the neighborhood where the weight of Ridgeview Heights didn't hang so heavy. Midway through the second round, Thomas leaned closer, voice dropping. "I don't know what's going on with you and Elena, but people are talking. Victor says she's not who she says she is." Daniel froze. "What do you mean?" Thomas shrugged uneasily. "He says he looked into her. Says she's connected to something classified, maybe even dangerous. Folks are nervous. They think the fence is to cover up whatever she's involved in." Anger flared hot in Daniel's chest. "That's ridiculous. She's private, that's all. You've met her? Do you think she's dangerous?" Thomas held up his hands. "I don't. But people believe Victor. He's convincing. And when he says something, the neighborhood listens." Daniel walked home in a haze, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. When he told Elena, she didn't look surprised. She simply folded her arms and said, "This is how control works. First isolation, then intimidation, finally fear. He's moving through the steps like a manual." Daniel studied her face, searching for cracks, but she was steady as stone. "You don't seem afraid," he said softly. She tilted her head. "That's because I've seen worse." It was only then that Daniel truly began to question just how much of his wife's life he didn't know. She had always been disciplined, yes, always composed. But the way she navigated this storm with patience, with strategy, with an almost clinical detachment, wasn't normal. At least not for anyone he knew. The next day, another letter arrived, this time in an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single printed page. "Security begins with transparency. If you have nothing to hide, prove it." Daniel crumpled it and slammed it on the counter. "This has to stop." Elena placed a hand on his arm, steady and firm. "It will. But not by reacting the way he wants. Let him think he's winning. The higher he climbs, the harder he falls." Her words, calm and deliberate, carried a weight Daniel couldn't ignore. He had married a woman he thought he understood, a fitness trainer with a private streak. But as the walls of Ridgeview Heights began to close in, he realized Elena wasn't just private. She was prepared. Prepared for exactly this kind of fight. And while Victor Hale whispered poison into the ears of their neighbors, Elena Carter sat in silence, her eyes sharp, her posture unyielding, waiting for the right moment to turn the game on him. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but the storm Victor had stirred was about to break, and Elena would be the lightning that cut through it. The notes, the whispers, the stolen glances, it had all been building toward something. Daniel felt it in the air, the way you feel pressure before a storm. Ridgeview Heights was no longer just uneasy. It was restless, waiting for a spark. And Victor Hale was ready to provide it. It happened on a warm Saturday afternoon. Daniel had just finished mowing the lawn when he noticed a cluster of neighbors forming down the street. Lawn chairs unfolded, children tugged at parents' sleeves, and the familiar black and white cruiser sat parked at the curb like a stage prop. At the center of it all stood Victor, polished badge gleaming on his belt posture, sharp as a drill sergeant. Community check-in, he called it. But Daniel knew better. This wasn't about community. This was a performance. Elena emerged from the house, quietly wiping her hands on a towel after finishing her morning training session. She looked composed, even casual. But Daniel recognized the small details others would miss, the way her eyes scanned the crowd, the way she adjusted her stance for balance, the faint tilt of her chin that gave her command of the space without saying a word. Victor waited until the circle had grown to nearly 20 neighbors. Parents, retirees, young couples, all gathered with that mix of curiosity and deference they always gave him. He raised his voice just enough to carry hands clasped behind his back. As many of you know, he began, our neighborhood prides itself on safety. We look out for each other, keep things transparent. That's why Ridgeview Heights is the safest place in the county. But safety, he paused dramatically, requires vigilance. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Daniel folded his arms, uneasy. Elena stood at his side, silent. Victor paced slowly, letting the weight of his words sink in. Unfortunately, not everyone shares the same commitment to openness. Some people prefer walls, secrets, barriers that cut them off from the community. His gaze drifted deliberately toward the Carters' 6-foot steel fence. And when people hide things, we have to ask ourselves why. Heads turned toward the Carters' property. Daniel felt the shift immediately. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was doubt. Suspicion. Victor's voice sharpened. I don't make accusations lightly, but I've looked into our new neighbors, and what I found should concern all of us. He paused again, milking the silence like a seasoned actor. Then he dropped the line that changed everything. Elena Carter isn't just a fitness consultant. She works at a classified military facility. Her role is marked confidential in government databases, which means we don't know who she really is or what she's capable of. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers. A woman pulled her child closer. An older man frowned deeply, muttering something under his breath. The word classified hung heavy in the air, a word loaded with implication but empty of explanation. Daniel's heart pounded. He wanted to shout, to call out Victor's lies for what they were. But before he could, Elena placed a hand lightly on his arm. It was a small touch, but firm. A command disguised as comfort. Her message was clear, not yet. Victor pressed on, sensing the crowd's unease. For all we know, she could be a liability, a threat. Classified roles exist for a reason, because they're too dangerous to share. And yet she lives among us, behind a wall taller than the law requires hiding God knows what. The murmurs grew louder now. Words floated in the air, dangerous, secret, military. Neighbors Daniel had waved to just weeks ago were now staring at Elena like she was a puzzle with missing pieces or a bomb with a hidden timer. Through it all, Elena stood perfectly still. Her shoulders square, her spine straight, her gaze steady. To the untrained eye, she looked calm. But Daniel knew better. He saw the micro-adjustments, the way her eyes tracked exits, the subtle shift of her weight, the slow control of her breathing. It wasn't calm. It was readiness. Victor pointed toward her now, the gesture accusatory. She won't answer questions. She won't explain what she does. And yet, we're supposed to trust her. He shook his head, letting indignation color his tone. I've spent my career protecting neighborhoods like this. I know what danger looks like. And I know when someone is hiding something from the people around them. Someone in the crowd asked, "So what do we do?" Victor seized the moment. We demand transparency. If she has nothing to hide, she should tell us what she really does. Otherwise, we can't guarantee the safety of this neighborhood. All eyes turned to Elena. The silence that followed stretched heavy as stone. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing down on him, urging him to speak, to defend her. But Elena remained unmoved. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She didn't take the bait. Instead, she let the silence grow, a tactic Daniel didn't understand until he noticed the effect. The longer she said nothing, the more uncomfortable the crowd became. Eyes shifted. Feet shuffled. The certainty Victor had whipped up began to waver under the stillness of her gaze. Victor's confidence faltered just for a heartbeat. He hadn't expected her to resist, not like this. He had expected panic excuses, maybe even anger. Instead, he was met with composure so controlled it unsettled even him. Daniel finally found his voice. "We've done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "Our fence is legal. Our lives are our own. We don't owe anyone an explanation for how we live." Victor sneered. That's exactly what someone with something to hide would say. The crowd rippled again, torn between fear and fairness. Daniel wanted to push harder to expose Victor's manipulation, but Elena's hand tightened on his arm again. Not now. Not like this. Victor closed the gathering with a final flourish. "I'll continue to keep this neighborhood safe as I always have. But I urge you all to be cautious. Watch closely, because safety depends on knowing who your neighbors really are." With that, he dismissed the crowd, leaving Daniel and Elena standing at the center of wary stares. As neighbors drifted away, Daniel turned to his wife, his voice low, urgent. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you defend yourself?" Elena's eyes followed Victor as he strolled back to his cruiser, basking in the illusion of authority. Only when he was out of earshot did she reply, "Because every word I speak now becomes a weapon in his hands. Silence is stronger. For now." Daniel exhaled shakily, frustration bubbling under his fear. But they believe him. Not all of them, Elena said. And belief built on whispers doesn't last forever. Truth does. Her calm unsettled him more than Victor's accusations. Because in that moment, Daniel realized she wasn't just reacting to Victor, she was strategizing, calculating, preparing. And as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across their steel fence, Daniel understood something he hadn't. Before, this wasn't a neighborly dispute anymore. This was a war of perception, of control of power. And Elena Carter was fighting it the only way she knew how, with patience, precision, and a discipline honed far from the quiet streets of Ridgeview Heights. The neighbors might see her as a mystery. Victor might paint her as a threat. But Daniel was beginning to grasp the truth. Elena wasn't dangerous to them. She was dangerous to him. And eventually, That danger would be the very thing that saved them all. The neighborhood meeting had ended, but the weight of it lingered like smoke that clung to the walls long after a fire. Daniel couldn't shake the looks their neighbors had given them, curious, fearful, doubtful. Elena, as always, seemed unaffected, though Daniel knew better. He had seen the way her jaw tightened ever so slightly, the way her eyes tracked Victor, even as she stood silent in the crowd. She wasn't afraid of him. She was measuring him. And Victor, drunk on his performance, mistook her silence for weakness. 1 week later, he escalated. It was a Thursday evening just after sunset. The air was heavy with the smell of cut grass and barbecue smoke from a block away. Daniel was in the garage organizing tools when headlights swept across the driveway. He stepped out expecting a delivery truck or maybe a lost neighbor. Instead, he saw the familiar black and white cruiser idling at the curb, and behind it another sedan. Victor stepped out first, as if stepping onto a stage, his polished badge glinting under the streetlight. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 men emerged from the sedan, both wearing dark uniforms that looked official enough at a glance, but lacked the crispness of true law enforcement. Their belts carried holstered pistols. Their shoulders bore patches Daniel didn't recognize, and their eyes carried the unease of men playing a role they weren't quite sure they belonged in. Victor strode up the driveway with deliberate confidence, the 2 men flanking him like bodyguards. Daniel felt his stomach knot. He glanced toward the house where he saw Elena through the front window, already standing with perfect posture, her expression unreadable. Mr. Carter, Victor called, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of triumph. We've received anonymous reports of suspicious late-night activity at your property. Possible storage of unauthorized materials. He gestured to the men behind him. These officers are here to assist me in a standard property inspection. Daniel blinked, heat rising in his chest. Suspicious activity. That's ridiculous. We haven't done anything. Before he could finish, Elena opened the front door. She stepped out onto the porch with measured calm, dressed in her black athletic gear hair tied neatly back. Her presence shifted the air instantly. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't even surprised. Victor's smile widened. Ah, Mrs. Carter. We'll need your cooperation. Just a quick inspection to clear this matter up. Elena descended the steps slowly, her movements precise, her eyes fixed on Victor. "And where is your search warrant?" she asked evenly. Victor faltered for a fraction of a second, then recovered. "No warrant necessary for a community security check. I'm a deputy sheriff. My authority here is more than enough." Elena's gaze flicked to the 2 men behind him, then back to Victor. "Every law enforcement action requires documentation. Warrants. Verification. That's procedure. You know that." For the first time, Victor's composure cracked. His smile twitched, his jaw tightening. "We don't need to complicate this. This is just a friendly inspection. If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind cooperating." Elena's voice remained calm, steady, unflinching. "If you were who you claim to be, you'd know I have every right to demand your badge number and a warrant signed by a judge. Produce those now, or leave." The words hung in the night air like a blade. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears, but Elena looked carved from stone. The 2 men in uniforms exchanged uneasy glances, shifting on their feet. One muttered something under his breath, almost inaudible. Victor's mask began to slip. His cheeks flushed red. His voice rose half a pitch higher. "Don't lecture me on procedure, lady. I've been keeping this neighborhood safe long before you moved here. People here trust me." He jabbed a finger toward the house. "You think a fancy fence gives you the right to defy law enforcement?" Elena took a single step forward, her tone now edged with steel. "You're not law enforcement. You're a man in a costume playing a dangerous game. And the longer you stand here without the paperwork I asked for, the clearer that becomes to everyone watching." Daniel realized then that neighbors had begun peeking through curtains, silhouettes framed in windows. Ridgeview Heights had always been a stage, and tonight Victor had chosen the Carters' porch as his theater. But for the first time, he wasn't the one commanding the scene. Victor's hand drifted dangerously close to his holster, his knuckles whitening. "Don't test me," he hissed. "I don't need a piece of paper to do my job." Elena's stance shifted subtly straighter, centered her weight, balanced like a soldier ready for combat. Her voice cut the night with a clarity that froze the moment. "Then you're admitting you're operating outside the law. And you've just proven everything I need to know about you." The two men behind Victor hesitated. One of them shifted uncomfortably and glanced back at the sedan, as if questioning why he had agreed to this in the first place. Their unease cracked the illusion further. Victor, sensing the cracks, but unwilling to back down, leaned in his voice, low and venomous. "You think you can intimidate me? You're nothing but—" Elena didn't let him finish. She straightened to her full height, her eyes sharp as glass. "Enough! You've overstepped. This ends now." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel held his breath, waiting for an explosion, but none came. Victor's mouth opened, then closed again, the words dying in his throat. His carefully constructed authority, the uniform, the cruiser. The staged inspection suddenly looked flimsy under the weight of Elena's unwavering composure. Finally, with a sharp jerk of his head, he turned back to his men. "We're done here," he barked. Without another word, he stalked back to his cruiser, his shoulders stiff, his control slipping with every step. The two men followed their steps quicker, eager to be gone. The engines roared to life, tires crunching over gravel as both cars disappeared down the street. Slowly, the night settled again, though the tension remained thick. Daniel exhaled hard, his knees weak. "Elena, what just happened?" She turned to him, her expression softening only slightly. He pushed too far. He wanted a confrontation. He thought intimidation would work. It didn't. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his voice trembling. "But what if he comes back? What if—" Elena cut him off, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "He will come back. Men like Victor always do. But now he knows I'm not afraid of him. And that changes the game." Daniel stared at her, truly seeing her in a new light. The calm, the control, the authority. This wasn't just the reaction of a strong-willed woman. This was training, experience, a lifetime of discipline. For the first time since moving to Ridgeview Heights, Daniel realized the truth he had been circling without naming his wife was not just prepared for men like Victor. She was built to face them. Inside the house, Elena checked the locks with practiced precision, her movements quick but deliberate. Daniel followed, still shaken, still reeling. "How did you know exactly what to say?" he asked quietly. She paused, meeting his eyes. "Because I've dealt with men like him before. Men who mistake fear for power. The difference is, I know the rules better than they ever will." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind buzzing with questions he didn't dare ask. Not yet. But one thing was clear, Victor Hale's authority wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. And Elena Carter had just struck the first blow. That night, after Victor stormed away with his counterfeit entourage, the Carters' house sat in a silence so heavy it pressed down like a storm cloud. Daniel kept pacing from room to room, his mind still echoing with Victor's threats, his nerves raw from the image of his neighbor's hand twitching near his holster. He couldn't shake the fear. What if Victor had pulled the trigger? What if Elena hadn't been so calm? Elena, however, wasn't pacing. She sat at the dining table, back straight, a small notebook in front of her. She was writing something, names, times, details Daniel couldn't follow. Her pen moved with precision, her face unreadable. Finally, Daniel couldn't take the silence anymore. Elena, I need answers. I need to know why you were able to handle that so perfectly. Why you weren't even rattled when he showed up with armed men at our door. She looked up slowly, her eyes steady on his. There was no irritation in her expression, only inevitability. Like she'd known this moment would come, and she'd been waiting for it. "Sit down, Daniel," she said softly. He did, lowering himself into the chair across from her, his chest tight. She closed the notebook and folded her hands on top of it. "There are things about me I haven't told you. Not because I don't trust you, but because my life, my work, has required secrecy. I thought moving here might allow me to keep that separation. But Victor's forced my hand." Daniel's throat was dry. "What are you saying?" She took a deep breath, her voice calm, but weighted with years of silence breaking open. "I'm not a fitness consultant. That's a cover I've used because it's vague enough to keep people from asking questions. The truth is, I'm Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Carter. I've served in the U.S. Navy for 15 years. For the last 12, I've been assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command. I train Navy SEALs at Coronado." The words struck Daniel like a physical blow. He blinked, trying to absorb them, but they seemed too big, too heavy to land all at once. You train SEALs at Coronado." She nodded, once her expression unwavering. "I develop and oversee training protocols, combat readiness, tactical awareness, endurance conditioning. I've deployed before, but my expertise has been in preparing others for missions, where survival depends on precision and discipline." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. 15 years. 12 with special warfare. All this time he had thought she was helping civilians with fitness regimens, maybe coaching corporate wellness programs. Instead, she'd been shaping the most elite soldiers in the world. "That's why you—" He trailed off, suddenly piecing together everything. The way she scanned rooms, the way she demanded warrants with legal certainty, the way she moved precise and economical. None of it had been quirks. It had been training, discipline, survival. She continued, her tone even. "I wasn't supposed to tell you. Classification protects families as much as it protects operations. But now, with Victor, the risk isn't just mine, it's yours too. You deserve the truth." Daniel pressed his palms to his forehead, trying to steady his breathing. "All this time? I didn't know." Her voice softened, though her posture didn't. "You knew enough. You knew I was disciplined. You knew I kept things close. You just didn't know why. Now you do." He looked up at her, his voice low. "So what about Victor? You said his authority was fake. Do you know for sure?" She opened the notebook again, flipping to a page where she had written names and numbers in neat block letters. "I started running his name through systems the moment he first tried to push us. Tonight confirmed what I suspected. Victor Hale isn't real. His real name is Victor Maddox." Daniel frowned. "Maddox, yes. Former private security. Fired from 3 different firms for abuse of authority and falsifying incident reports. He's been arrested 4 times for impersonating officers, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico. Each time he skipped jurisdictions and started over somewhere new. Here he reinvented himself again. Bought replica uniforms, fake badges, even a cruiser shell. He built a persona strong enough to fool a neighborhood that wanted to believe it was protected." Daniel felt a chill run through him. "So he's nothing, just a fraud." Elena's eyes hardened. "Fraud, yes. But dangerous. Men like Maddox thrive on control. They don't just want power, they need it. And when someone threatens that illusion, they become reckless." Daniel shook his head, slowly, disbelief heavy in his chest. All this time, we thought he was law enforcement. The neighbors thought he was protecting them. And he's just a security guard who got fired. Not just fired, Elena corrected. Sued. Twice. Families accused him of harassment, intimidation, impersonation. He's been chasing legitimacy he'll never earn, so he steals it with fear. And Ridgeview Heights was his stage. He picked us because the fence gave him an excuse. But once he saw who I was, or thought I might be, he escalated. Daniel rubbed his face, overwhelmed. How did you even find all this? You said you ran his name through systems. She gave the faintest smile, though it held no humor. When you work in special warfare, you learn where to look. You learn who to call. I have contacts in naval intelligence, the FBI, even civilian databases, not open to the public. Victor isn't careful. He leaves patterns. And patterns are easy to track when you know how. She turned the notebook toward him. There, in crisp handwriting, were records, case numbers, arrest dates, jurisdictions. Next to them, notes about forged documents, false IDs, shell companies. Daniel stared, his stomach churning. This is bigger than just a neighbor dispute. Yes, she said quietly. Much bigger. He's been running this play for years, intimidating families into submission, using fear and fake authority to control communities. But this time, he chose the wrong target. He chose us. Daniel's voice cracked with a mixture of awe and fear. You're not just going to let this go, are you? Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, met his. No. Men like Maddox don't stop until someone stops them. And I've spent 15 years preparing people to confront threats just like him. It's what I do. It's who I am. For the first time, Daniel saw the full truth of the woman he had married. Not just disciplined, not just private, but forged by years of service, carrying a strength few people in the world would ever understand. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, a strange mix of relief and terror coursing through him. So, what do we do now? Elena closed the notebook, her expression resolute. Now we prepare, because Victor Maddox thinks he's still in control. But he has no idea what's coming. Outside, the night was quiet again, but Daniel no longer heard the silence as peaceful. It was waiting for the next move in a battle that had already begun, a battle between a man clinging to a stolen identity and a woman who had built hers in truth, discipline, and unshakable authority. The night Elena revealed her truth, Daniel barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying her words, 15 years in the Navy, 12 of them training SEALs at Coronado. He thought back to every detail he had overlooked, her precision, her silence, her readiness. She had been carrying that weight all along, and now it had become their shield. By dawn, Elena was already moving. She sat at the dining table with her phone, her notebook, and a laptop Daniel had never seen before, its surface scratched from years of use. She typed quickly, spoke softly into the phone, and shifted effortlessly between coded language and clipped military terms. Daniel watched from the doorway, realizing that the woman he loved was not just stepping into action, she was stepping into her element. That afternoon, Elena received a call that changed everything. The name on her screen read, Torres. She answered with a steady voice, Rafael. On the other end was FBI Special Agent Rafael Torres, a man who had once trained beside her during joint exercises between the Bureau and Naval Special Warfare. He now worked counterintelligence, and when Elena explained Victor Maddox's history of impersonation, Torres didn't hesitate. Elena, this isn't just harassment, Torres said, his voice low and clipped. This is organized. We've had similar reports in Arizona and Nevada families with military ties being pushed out of neighborhoods. We couldn't connect the dots before. If Maddox is at the center, you might be sitting on the key piece we need. Elena leaned forward, her eyes flashing with certainty. Then let's get proof. Within 48 hours, Torres's team discreetly outfitted the Carters' property with surveillance equipment. Tiny cameras disguised as porch screws, microphones embedded in decorative lights, a long-range parabolic microphone positioned 2 houses down with the cooperation of a trusted contact. Elena herself planted a listening device inside a hollowed-out garden ornament at the edge of their yard, her movements so natural no passerby could have guessed its true purpose. The first breakthrough came late one night. Victor was standing at the end of his driveway phone, pressed to his ear voice, low but sharp. Elena and Torres listened in from her laptop as the recording streamed live. "This neighborhood's too smart," Victor hissed. "Too many people asking questions. I've already got the Carters marked they're stubborn, but we'll force them out. Once 3 or 4 families fold, we can control the whole block. Then we start raising fees and flipping the properties. $2,000 a month per house, easy profit." Daniel felt his stomach drop. It wasn't just about them. It was about money, control, fraud dressed in the uniform of authority. Torres's voice came over the secure line. "That's it. That's conspiracy to commit fraud on record. Keep him talking, Elena. The more, the better." Over the next week, they collected hours of evidence. Conversations with shadowy partners, plans to forge more documents, boasts about intimidating families into selling below market value. Victor even bragged about connections in other states, though his paranoia kept him from naming them directly. Finally, Torres gave the green light. "We have enough to move." But exposure is always cleaner when the community sees the truth with their own eyes. Maddox built his power on their fear. If you take that away in public, he has nothing left. Elena nodded, her face calm but resolute. Then we set the stage. She drafted an invitation for a neighborhood forum, framing it as an opportunity to resolve lingering tensions over property disputes. Daniel helped distribute the notices to every mailbox in Ridgeview Heights. The wording was neutral, diplomatic, almost boring, exactly the kind of thing to stroke Victor's ego into believing he had already won. On Saturday afternoon, neighbors gathered in folding chairs under the shade of oaks. Daniel stood near the back, his stomach in knots. Victor arrived dressed in his sharpest polo fake badge, polished hair slicked back. His wife trailed behind him, her smile rehearsed. They moved like victors approaching a celebration, not suspects walking into a trap. Elena, dressed in a simple black blazer, took the front. She stood tall, her hands clasped calmly before her, her eyes sweeping the crowd with quiet command. When she spoke, her voice carried with clarity that silenced even the restless children. "Before we talk about fences or neighborhood disputes," she began, "we need to discuss the matter of security. Real security." She turned to Victor, her expression neutral. "Deputy Hale, since you've presented yourself as our law enforcement representative, would you mind sharing your badge number with us, for the record?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victor stiffened. He had expected applause, not questions. His smile faltered. "That's sensitive information. I can't just give that out in public." Elena didn't flinch. "All badge numbers are a matter of public record. Any legitimate officer would know that. So, again, your badge number, please." Whispers grew louder. Neighbors leaned toward one another, suspicion flickering where once there had been blind trust. Victor laughed, but it was thin, brittle. "The system doesn't always update, right? Special assignments, undercover work, those names don't show up online." Elena pressed a button on her laptop. Behind her, a projector screen lit up, displaying the official directory of the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. She scrolled slowly, name by name. And yet, I've searched every active roster. There is no record of a Victor Hale. Not now. Not ever. The gasps were audible. Victor's face reddened, his jaw tightening. This is nonsense. Fabricated. She's trying to smear me. Elena clicked again, and a new document filled the screen, a receipt for a replica badge purchased from an online costume company, shipped directly to Victor's address. This, she said calmly, is not law enforcement. This is impersonation, a federal crime. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Chairs scraped against pavement. Victor's wife tried to protest, but her voice was drowned out. And it doesn't end there. Elena continued, her tone sharp but steady. Victor Hale's real name is Victor Maddox. He has been arrested 4 times for impersonating officers in 3 different states. And now we have him on tape conspiring to defraud families in this very neighborhood. At that, she pressed another button. The speakers crackled to life with Victor's own voice. The Carters are stubborn, but we'll force them out. Once we control the block, we flip the properties. $2,000 a month, easy profit. The words hung in the air like a death knell. Neighbors who had once admired him now recoiled. Parents pulled children closer. Some stood pointing, shouting. The illusion was shattered. Victor's mask finally cracked. His face contorted with rage, his voice rising to a shout. This is all lies. She's lying to you. She's dangerous. She's been trained to kill. In a sudden motion, he pulled what looked like a service weapon from his belt and leveled it at Elena. Screams erupted. Chairs toppled. The crowd scattered in panic. But Elena didn't move. Her eyes locked on him, her body perfectly still. Then, in less than 3 seconds, she acted. With blinding speed, she closed the distance, twisting his wrist, stripping the weapon from his hand before he could even react. She pivoted, swept his legs, and had him face down on the ground, hands zip-tied behind his back, with a restraint she produced from her blazer pocket. The entire sequence was over before most of the crowd realized what had happened. Elena stood over him, her voice steady, commanding. Victor Maddox, you are under citizen's arrest for impersonating a law enforcement officer, aggravated assault, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it. The silence that followed broke into thunderous applause. Someone shouted, "She saved us!" Another cried, "I knew something was wrong with him." Phones recorded every second, and within minutes, the video was already spreading online. Daniel, standing at the back, felt his heart swell with a mixture of awe and disbelief. His wife, calm and unshaken, had dismantled Victor's illusion in front of everyone. When FBI agents led by Rafael Torres swept in moments later to take Victor into custody, the neighborhood had already transformed. The man who once ruled through fear was exposed as nothing more than a fraud. And the woman who had stood silently in his shadow revealed herself as the protector they truly needed. The night Victor Maddox was taken away in handcuffs, Ridgeview Heights did not sleep. Porch lights burned late into the hours past midnight. Neighbors huddled in small groups at the ends of driveways, whispering in awe at what they had just witnessed. The man who had paraded himself as their protector, the deputy sheriff who claimed to guard their safety, had been revealed as a fraud before their very eyes. And the woman he had accused of being dangerous, the one who had stood silent through weeks of rumor and intimidation, had become their shield, their truth, their undeniable proof that strength was not what Maddox had wielded. By dawn, the video of Elena subduing him had gone viral. It spread from one phone to the next, then onto local news broadcasts, and by noon, national networks had replayed the footage. The world watched in disbelief as a woman in a black blazer disarmed and restrained a violent imposter in less than 3 seconds. The clip was analyzed, slowed frame by frame, by experts who marveled at her precision, her composure. Commentators called it the calmest takedown ever captured on camera. Parents called it proof that courage still lived quietly among them. The FBI moved quickly. With Victor's arrest came raids on storage units, shell companies, and accomplice safe houses across 3 states. What they uncovered was staggering: a network that had been running for nearly 5 years, systematically targeting neighborhoods near military installations. Their tactic was always the same: impersonate law enforcement, sow fear, isolate military families, and pressure them into selling their homes at below-market prices. Once families fled, the properties were funneled into Maddox's shell. Companies flipped for massive profit. 23 operatives were arrested across 6 states. 40 military families had been forced from their neighborhoods. $15 million in financial damage had been traced back to Maddox's operations. What had begun with whispers and offense in Ridgeview Heights now stood exposed as a coordinated assault on those who dedicated their lives to national defense. In the weeks that followed, Elena was no longer the quiet woman who jogged at sunrise and trained privately in her backyard. She was hailed as a protector, her name spoken with respect, not just in Ridgeview Heights, but far beyond. Naval Special Warfare Command commended her publicly for extraordinary service in the defense of military families. The FBI credited her with cracking a case they had been chasing for years. Journalists requested interviews, though Elena declined most, preferring to stay with her community. Her choice spoke volumes. Because Elena understood that the true victory wasn't in her own commendation, it was in the transformation of Ridgeview Heights itself. The very next neighborhood meeting was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. Gone were the fearful silences, the deferential nods to Victor's self-imposed authority. In their place stood neighbors who were finally ready to speak, to ask questions, to demand transparency. Retirees who once avoided eye contact now volunteered for oversight committees. Young parents who had whispered suspicions now voiced them openly. The spell had been broken, and in its place something new was being built. At that first meeting, Elena stood at the back, content to listen. But inevitably, someone turned to her. Margaret Liu, a 73-year-old retired teacher, rose with her cane in hand. "We need safeguards," she said firmly. "We need structures to ensure no one can ever manipulate us again. And I can think of no one better to guide us than the woman who protected us when it mattered most. I nominate Elena Carter for leadership." Applause erupted, thunderous and heartfelt. Daniel looked at his wife, expecting her to refuse. And she did, in her own way. "I don't want power over you," Elena said, her voice carrying across the room with calm authority. "What I want is to empower you. Real strength doesn't control, it protects. And the more each of you learns to protect yourselves and each other, the stronger this neighborhood will be." Her words became the motto of Ridgeview Heights. Within weeks, Elena began organizing workshops. On Tuesday evenings, she gathered neighbors in the community park and taught situational awareness, how to notice exits, how to spot manipulation, how to stand firm without escalation. On Saturday mornings, she ran self-defense classes for women and teenagers, showing them basic holds, escapes, and confidence drills. She didn't present it as combat, but as preparation tools for survival, both physical and psychological. Daniel often watched from the sidelines, marveling at how the children looked up to her. They mimicked her stances, laughed as they practiced moves, begged for one more demonstration. Parents thanked her afterward with tears in their eyes, saying they hadn't realized how much fear had lived in them until she gave them tools to counter it. The fence, once the center of their conflict, took on new meaning. Neighbors who had once whispered that it was too tall now pointed to it as a symbol of dignity. It stood not as a wall of suspicion, but as a reminder that boundaries are not just physical, they are moral, personal, communal. To respect a boundary is to respect the person behind it. To attack a boundary is to reveal your own weakness. One afternoon, Daniel stood by that fence while Elena wrapped up a workshop. A group of children clustered around her wide-eyed, asking if she would show them the super-fast move she had used on Victor Maddox. Elena laughed, shaking her head. "That's not what you need," she told them gently. "The real move is this trust. Your instincts trust each other. And don't let fear decide your choices. That's how you stay safe." It was then Daniel realized what she had done. She hadn't just exposed a fraud. She had redefined what leadership meant for an entire neighborhood. She had turned fear into awareness, passivity, into participation, suspicion, into solidarity. Months later, Ridgeview Heights hosted its first Unity Day, a celebration Elena helped organize. Families filled the park with food and music. Children played games where once parents had feared letting them outside. Retirees shared stories, young couples shared hopes. And at the center of it all was a small ceremony, dedicating the new playground. A bronze plaque was unveiled at its entrance, inscribed with simple words, "For those who protect not by control, but by courage." As the sun set over the gathering, Daniel stood beside Elena, his arm around her shoulders. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly, "revealing who you are, bringing all of this into the open?" Elena looked toward the children laughing on the swings, the neighbors talking freely, the fence standing tall in the background. She smiled faintly. "There are times when secrets protect us," she said. "But there are also times when the truth is the only thing that can protect the people we love." Daniel followed her gaze and felt a swell of pride he had never known before. The neighborhood they had chosen for peace had given them anything but. Yet in the end, it had become stronger than he could have imagined, because Elena had stood, because she had refused to bend, because she had taught them all that resilience was greater than fear. The fence still stood 6 feet high, black steel gleaming in the fading light. But it was no longer a symbol of conflict. It was a monument to dignity, to privacy, to the right of every family to live without intimidation. And in the laughter of children, the conversations of neighbors, the unity that had replaced division, Daniel heard the echo of Elena's words, "Real strength protects, not controls." And for the first time since moving to Ridgeview Heights, Daniel knew the neighborhood wasn't just a place to live. It was a community reborn. The story of Daniel and Elena Carter in Ridgeview Heights is more than a neighborhood drama. It's a mirror for America. A man with no real authority dressed in a costume of law nearly tore a community apart through fear, rumor, and intimidation. Yet it only took one family's refusal to bend one woman's strength, built on discipline, truth, and service, to unravel the deception. The lesson is as old as our nation's founding freedom survives only when ordinary people refuse to surrender to false power. Every American should take this to heart. Whether you live in a suburb, a small town, or a city of 8 million people, you have the same responsibility to know your rights, to question authority when it feels wrong, and to protect your neighbors as much as yourself. Elena's 6-foot fence became more than steel and bolts. It became a symbol of dignity and resilience, a reminder that boundaries matter. But fences alone don't keep us safe. Awareness does. Unity does. Courage does. The FBI uncovered a network that had forced 40 military families out of their homes across 6 states, causing more than $15 million in losses. If one woman had not stood her ground, how many more families would have been silenced, displaced, erased? That is why this story should not just be watched, it should be remembered, discussed, and acted upon. To my fellow citizens, stay alert. Teach your children to recognize the difference between real authority and false power. Support those who serve with integrity, but never blindly follow anyone simply because they wear a badge, a title, or a uniform. Real strength is never about control. It's about protection, community, and truth. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to what can happen right on an ordinary street in broad daylight, then help us spread it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss stories that reveal the hidden battles shaping our neighborhoods. Like this video to show your support and share it with friends, family, and co-workers, because awareness is the first defense. Together as one nation, we can make sure no imposter, no fraud, no false guardian ever steals our peace again.